What if I told you Spain once had a king who, basically never left his bed? Not because he was paralyzed. Not because he'd been injured. But because he was genuinely convinced his body was falling apart and that he was already dead. That king was Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King. He was supposed to bring the country back to glory, a fresh start after the draining war of the Spanish Succession. His rule stretched across a vast empire, from the Americas all the way to the Philippines. And what did Spain actually get in return? A monarch who stayed buried under his blankets for weeks, refused any kind of care, and wouldn't even allow his room to be cleaned. A man who summoned doctors again and again, demanding they examine him because he was certain he was rotting while still alive. Picture this: ministers stepping into a dim, suffocating room where the stale air barely moves and candlelight hardly outlines the king's silhouette. Important papers, the kind that shape the future of the nation, are pushed under his covers. Musicians stand near his bedside, not to entertain him, but simply to coax him into opening his mouth and taking a few bites of food. This isn't a myth. It isn't a metaphor. This was Spain in the 1700s. And it's the story of a monarch who turned his bedroom into his throne room, and his entire empire into something resembling a tragic comedy. But to understand how Spain reached this point, we need to step back a few decades, back to the childhood of this peculiar king. Versailles, a place dripping with gold and mirrors, where even a single step sends an echo rolling through the marble corridors. And right in the middle of all that glitter and ceremony grows a boy born from the most powerful bloodline in Europe. His grandfather is none other than Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man before whom both monarchs and popes bowed in fear. From the moment Philippe draws his first breath, he's treated less like a child and more like an emblem. Every step he takes, every gesture he makes, is carefully watched. He's expected to represent the might of France and the rising promise of Spain. Then comes 1700. Charles II, the last of the Habsburgs, dies, and 17-year-old Philip V suddenly finds himself King of Spain. His coronation triggers the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that will drag on for 14 long years. But behind all that dazzling grandeur, something else was brewing. Even in his youth, Philip seemed unusually delicate. He could pray for hours, repeating the same phrases over and over like an incantation. A single, impure, thought was enough to send him spiraling into panic. His devotion didn't look like faith, it looked like fixation. And sometimes, things turned even stranger. Picture a room filled with courtiers, everyone waiting for the prince to greet the guests. Then, out of nowhere, he stops in place. His body stiffens. His stare goes vacant. 1 minute passes, then 2, then 3. No one dares to shift. Finally, he blinks, slow and distant, as though he's just snapped back from some far-off place. Some whispered it was a moment of divine rapture. Others saw it for what it probably was, a troubling sign that there was something deeply unstable in him. Spain had hoped for a ruler who was bold and commanding. What they got instead was someone visibly fragile, someone whose inner darkness only grew with time. And that shadow, the one that hovered at the edge of his mind, would eventually expand into a full abyss. Because when he finally took the throne, the first words that left his lips were, "I am already dead." Madrid's royal palace. Early morning. Ministers crowd the hallways clutching urgent documents, military orders, letters meant for foreign allies, financial decrees for the treasury. Everyone stands by, just waiting for the king's signature. When they step into his room, they find it nearly suffocating. Heavy curtains block the light, barely any air circulates, and the few candles still burning give off a weak, flickering glow. In the middle of that dimness lies the king. Philip is curled under his blanket, staring blankly up at the ceiling. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister says, offering him a pen, "these papers must be signed." Philip turns his head with agonizing slowness. His voice is soft, but steady. "I am already dead." Later researchers would suggest that Philip might have shown signs of Cotard syndrome, a rare psychological condition where a person becomes convinced they are dead or hollow inside. It's only speculation, but it does provide some explanation for his unsettling phrases like, "I am dead," or "I'm rotting." Modern historians also believe that Philip's condition wasn't limited to isolated delusions. In the last decade of his life, he showed clear signs of severe clinical depression and possibly bipolar disorder. Contemporary letters describe sudden mood crashes, periods of paralyzing despair, and days when he couldn't speak, eat, or respond, long before he started claiming he was already dead. The servants freeze in place. The royal physician steps forward, trying gently to reason with him. "That's not true, Your Majesty. You're speaking to us, you're alive." Philip simply turns his face away. The dead don't sign anything. The room goes painfully silent. One minister makes a weak attempt at humor, but the sound of his laughter feels thin and unnatural. From that day on, this scene basically became routine. Each time officials brought him decrees, the king refused them, repeating the same line, "I am already dead." Papers stacked up, and the machinery of government nearly ground to a halt. Physicians tried every trick they could think of, holding a mirror under his nose to show he breathed, guiding his hand to touch a minister's warm skin, but Philip stayed firm. "There is nothing inside me." Imagine the absurdity of it, a sprawling empire, rich with American gold and territory stretching into Asia, being ruled by a man who sincerely believed he was a corpse. And on the days he still spoke, there was no guarantee he would even rise from his bed the next morning. Then, in 1724, things took an even more bizarre turn. Philip stepped down from the throne and passed the crown to his son, Louis. But Louis ruled only a few months before dying at a tragically young age. 6 days after the boy's death, Philip was back on the throne again. Spain ended up with a king who tried to run from his own crown, but the crown refused to release him. His talk about being dead was only the beginning. After that came the true descent into darkness. Philip eventually stopped leaving his bed altogether. At first it lasted a few days, then it became weeks. His bedroom turned into a kind of velvet-lined crypt, a place he couldn't, or wouldn't, escape. He refused to step outside, and even basic self-care vanished. His hair grew wild, his nails lengthened, and his appearance became unsettling. Court officials began carrying state papers straight to his bedside, and ministers held their meetings standing around him. He would make random, automatic marks with a pen, toss it aside, and stare past everyone in the room as if they weren't real, as if they were spirits drifting around him. On paper, the official explanation was simple: the king was resting. But everyone knew the truth: Spain was being governed from a mattress. And then a new, more chilling sentence appeared. "My body is rotting. I am rotting alive." One morning he started repeating it with frightening conviction. "I'm decaying. My body is decomposing." People from his era wrote that Philip demanded the doctors prove it scientifically. They held a mirror under his nose, checked his breath and pulse, trying to reassure him. Sometimes he insisted on even more. He begged them to confirm that worms were already inside him. It was his own way of describing pure terror. The doctors kept telling him it wasn't true, but he even stopped eating. "I can't. I'm already rotting." A suffocating heaviness filled his chambers. The bed, unchanged for far too long, only deepened his belief that he was decomposing where he lay. For the courtiers, it was horrifying. Their king truly believed he had already died. And Philip kept whispering the same line. "I am here among you, but I am no longer alive." His bedroom slowly turned into a stage set. The blanket became his throne, and Philip himself transformed into the central prop, the one piece without which the machinery of government couldn't function. Ministers tiptoed inside and slid documents toward him. Doctors literally guided his hand to the pen. The signature he left behind was shaky and smudged, but once the royal seal was added, the laws of Spain were officially approved. To coax him into eating, they brought in musicians. Violins, choirs, entire ensembles, performed beside his bed, trying to pull him out of his morbid thoughts. Occasionally the king would blink, focus for a moment, and swallow a bite of bread. Then came 1737. Farinelli, the legendary castrato singer, was summoned to court. His assignment? Cure the king through music. Every night he sang the same 4 arias, over and over, and this continued for years. If Farinelli didn't perform, the king refused to eat or sign anything. While the court acted out its daily rituals around his bedside, there was one true director behind the scenes. Elizabeth Farnese, Philip V's second wife. When Philip married Elizabeth in 1714, everything at court shifted. She would eventually assume control once her husband was completely overwhelmed by his illnesses. She entered his life when he was already mentally fragile. And slowly, she transformed his bedroom into her command center. Ministers who had once obeyed the king now watched only her face. If she nodded, a decree received a signature. If she didn't, the document vanished into the folds of the bed covers. Rumors spread that Elizabeth kept her husband in a kind of sweet captivity. She understood every one of his vulnerabilities and supervised the doctors and priests, ensuring they acted on her instructions. She didn't have to convince him, she governed by using his condition. Imagine it, a monarchy where the real decisions no longer came from the king, but from the woman sitting in the adjoining room. Could anyone claim he was ruling? Servants whispered stories. While Philip drifted through his delusions, Elizabeth negotiated with diplomats next door. Ministers signed agreements that served her interests, not his. She wasn't merely the king's wife, she oversaw the armies, the treasury, foreign alliances. Some said she was the one who determined which wars Spain entered, which nations it supported, and which it abandoned. Think about that, the most critical decisions weren't made in the throne room, but at the foot of a bed. And the entire Spanish Empire now relied on a man who couldn't even lift his head from his pillow. People murmured, "We don't have a king. We have a queen." To some she was a formidable leader, to others, the quiet executioner of Spain. But the truth was unmistakable, the empire that had once belonged to Philip was now firmly in Elizabeth's hands. The king lay under his covers, convinced he was already dead. And his wife signed the documents that shaped the future of millions. But even that wasn't the end, because soon a new rumor would take hold. One that claimed Philip surrounded himself with the dead. You'd think the absurdity had already reached its breaking point, a monarch who couldn't rise from his bed, a ruler who insisted he was dead. But the story didn't end there. Imagine the headlines today if a president demanded corpses be brought into his bedroom so he could compare himself to them and confirm he was still alive. In later chronicles and palace gossip, a chilling legend took shape. People claimed that Philip ordered dead bodies brought to his room so he could examine them and reassure himself that he wasn't actually one of them. There's no solid evidence for this, and historians generally treat it as a courtly myth. But the fact that such a rumor existed at all shows just how unsettling and bizarre his behavior must have seemed to those around him. Picture the scene these rumors described: a darkened room, suffocating silence, the king hidden under blankets with a haunted stare. And next to him, lifeless bodies, supposedly there to help him insist. "Look. They are dead. And I'm still alive." Whether any of this truly happened is impossible to know. But the legend spread quickly through the court, terrifying some and providing others with an explanation for everything they were witnessing. A monarch who believed he was dead had turned his bedroom into a symbolic morgue. People outside the palace heard fragments of the stories and whispered, "The king sleeps among the dead." The empire that had once shaped the world's politics now resembled a haunted theater, its leading actor checking his pulse against the lifeless, or so the rumors claimed. How would anyone react if they heard this about their own ruler? It sounds like something from a horror film, but for Spaniards back then, it was practically routine. And while these grim tales circulated through the palace, Spain itself was slipping further into decline, growing colder, weaker, inching toward its own downfall. While the king lay in his symbolic pillow morgue, the nation weakened alongside him. 18th-century Spain still owned vast territories, stretching from the Americas to Asia. But instead of strengthening trade or expanding the army, the government was drowning in court intrigue. Ministers pushed their personal agendas, and Queen Elizabeth placed her own favorites in key positions. The military was deteriorating. The once fearsome navy that had dominated the oceans was now decaying in its ports. England was building a naval empire while Spanish ships sat idle, waiting for the signature of a ruler who never left his bed. The colonies in the Americas were stumbling too. Instead of flowing with gold and silver, they were producing more unrest and fewer profits. One decree, one delay, could change entire borders. And if the king didn't sign, nothing happened. Across Europe, diplomats asked, "What decision has the King of Spain made?" And the answer, again and again, was the same. He hasn't gotten out of bed today. 1746, in the same dim bedroom of the Madrid palace, surrounded by the blankets and pillows where he had spent so much of his life, King Philip V finally passed away. The body he had believed was dead for decades was now truly cold. Doctors let out quiet sighs. Ministers did too. The entire court seemed to breathe for the first time in years. But that breath tasted bitter. The Spain he left behind had already lost the splendor it once possessed. He isn't remembered as a reformer. Or a brilliant commander. Or a wise statesman. No, his name survives as the king who never got out of bed. The man who governed an empire without ever rising from beneath his blankets. People of his time compared him to another tragic European ruler, Charles VI of France, the Glass King, terrified he would shatter at the slightest touch. Charles feared breaking, Philip feared rotting. Both became prisoners of their own minds, and both dragged their countries down with them. Philip V lay there, certain he was dead and worthless. And in a grim way, Spain became exactly that, feeble, hollowed out, and slowly destroyed by corruption and decay. His entire reign resembled a bizarre theater. Musicians performed for a dead monarch, officials slipped documents between his blankets, and an entire empire waited on decisions from a man who had long since lost his grip on reality. And in the end, the metaphor he lived by turned literal. The king who feared decay ended up presiding over the decay of his own nation. Back then, the monarch under the blanket was the problem. Today, it could be any leader who becomes trapped in their own delusions. The story of Philip V reminds us that when power isolates itself from reality, it's not just the leader who falls apart, it's the entire country that crumbles with them.